Thank you and good afternoon. It is my absolute pleasure to talk to you for the next half hour or so about our newest interactive tool for exploring work exposures in Europe, the European Occupational Exposure Viewer, or OEV. The OEV is a tool developed under the Exposome Project for Health and Occupational Research, or EPHOR project. The project aims to provide better insight into relationship between working life and health. As we are coming near the end of the project, we're thinking about our original goal of laying the groundwork for evidence-based and cost-effective prevention. The tool I'll be showing you today fits this aim particularly well, and we hope this tool will be able to support such endeavors for our stakeholders. The highlight of my presentation today will be the introduction and live demonstration of the OEV. You see a little preview of the tool on the right. However, I would like to first explain how we made the tool. The tool is essentially a combination of the EuroJEM with the European population data from Eurostat. I will now take a few minutes to introduce to you what a GEM is and tell you how we converted the EuroJEM estimates to exposure prevalence estimates using the European population data from Eurostat. A job exposure matrix is an exposure assessment tool that models work exposure by occupation. GEMs are usually created with a mix of exposure measurement and expert assessment. Primarily, they're designed for use in occupational health studies to study the relationship between work exposure and disease. They may also be applied for health impact assessment and exposure surveillance purposes. The use of EuroJEM to make OEV fits in this last use case. On the right, you see a fictional GEM with 3 jobs and 3 exposures. This represents what the simplest GEMs could look like. As you can see, the modeled exposure could be a simple dichotomous yes-no exposure for A, or no categories for exposure B, or quantitative concentrations for exposure C. GEMs could also include other variables in addition to exposure concentrations. For instance, there could be an estimate for the probability of exposure. Different time periods may result in different exposure estimates. The same goes for different geographic regions, worker sex, as well as seasons. Currently, the EuroJEM has estimates for 14 different work exposures. 4 chemical, 2 physical, 5 physical workload, and 3 psychosocial. This table gives you an idea of the different variables we have for each exposure. Primarily, we utilize the exposure probability variable of the different exposures to estimate how many workers are exposed in different countries. If applicable, we further use the exposure concentrations to estimate the level of exposure. All other variables, if applicable, are also applied to ensure the EuroJEM estimates are correctly applied to the European population. Here, I would like to insert a quick plug for the EuroJEM, which was officially launched earlier in March. The EuroJEM is hosted by our partner at KI in Sweden. You may learn more about the EuroJEM on their website. Okay, so we have exposure, probabilities, and other characteristics for 14 EuroJEM substances. How do we turn these into estimates of exposed workers in different European countries? For this, we turn to quarterly and annual labor force survey data collected by Eurostat. Labor force data is collected from the 27 European member states, plus Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK up to Q3 of 2020. For the OEV, we are interested in labor participation information by occupation, sex, year, and country. Currently, LFS occupation information is available in ISCO 08 classification system. However, because the EuroJEM was developed in ISCO 88COM, the OEV tool will show occupation by ISCO 88COM. All right, it's time to show you a little bit around the OEV. Before I start moving and clicking around the interactive tool live, I would take a couple minutes to introduce to you the components of the OEV. Once you follow a link to the OEV, the page will first load for a few seconds, and once it's done, you'll see a page like this. On the top, you'll see input fields for exposure, country, year, and worker sex. These fields are quite intuitive and work by either typing or scrolling through available options. On the bottom, you see the main visualization, currently showing the pattern of diesel exposure exhaust in male workers in Italy in 2011. The visualization is called a tree map, in which the size of the rectangles represent the size of population exposed by occupation. For instance, if we look at the largest rectangle, we see that it represents roughly 300,000 heavy truck and lorry drivers exposed to diesel engine exhaust. If we look at a smaller square, we can see that this one represents around 100,000 motor vehicle mechanics exposed. You may notice that the boxes are also in different shades of blue. That's because low, medium, and high levels of exposures are being represented respectively by light, medium, and dark blue. If we mouse over the box for mechanics, an additional tooltip shows up and gives us more information, including a statement on respiratory and cardiovascular health effects of diesel engine exhaust exposure. For those interested, we also provided reference for the health effects statement. Let me now try to show you the tool live. I've just followed the link to the tool itself. And as I said, it took a few seconds to load up here. Let me try to get a nicer view. Okay, this is the same screen as I showed you before in the screen capture. Let's now change the exposure to something else other than diesel engine exhaust. Let's also update the country to the Netherlands, the year to 2018. Exposure to hardwood dust causes nasal cancer and allergies. If I leave any of the selection fields empty, for instance like this, the tool will not show any visualization. For wood dust in the Netherlands in 2018 for male workers, here we can see roughly 72,000 workers employed as carpenters and joiners being exposed to wood dust. The next biggest job is building frame workers at around 16,000. We see a smaller, darker box below indicating high exposure. If we mouse over that, we see it's wood product machine operators at around 36,000 workers. Let's change the view to female only to see if the most exposed jobs are any different. Right away, we notice that the number of exposed workers in different occupations are much smaller. This is because women work less in these trades that are exposed to wood dust. On this visualization, we also notice upholsters and music instrument makers appear as top exposed jobs. They're right here, as well as here. For male workers, these are also present, but they rank much lower compared to the number of workers in construction. If we wanted to, there's a screenshot button on the upper right of the tool for us to save this picture And we can save this for presentation or comparison purposes. Let's bring the two sexes back together and change our exposure to nickel. Nickel is a metal, and exposures to nickel compounds is associated with lung and nasal cancer. Here we see a very different set of exposed jobs compared to wood dust. The top exposed jobs are all jobs working with metal or metal parts, such as machine tool operators, as well as agricultural or industrial machinery mechanics and fitters, both at around 30,000 exposed. The next biggest job exposed is welders at around 13,000. One of the most interesting functions of the OEV is the ability to explore multiple exposures at once. Let's add heavy lifting and see what happens. Immediately, you see that heavy lifting in orange is much more prevalent compared to nickel, which is still in a mustard yellow color here. The most exposed jobs here is transport laborers at close to 92,000. However, next to it, we do see some boxes with both orange and yellow. If we mouse over that, we see this is machine tool operators with around 30,000 workers exposed to nickel, as well as 7,000 workers exposed to heavy lifting. We can also click on this particular job so that the visualization is entirely made up of this job here. To go back to the previous view, we can simply click on the gray bar here. Let's change the view again. If we replace nickel with hands above shoulder, which is another physical exposure, we see that the distribution is much more even. Our top exposed job is still transport and freight laborers. In fact, for our tool, we can keep adding different exposures to the tool. For instance, I can add forward bending posture, kneeling and squatting, as well as fast breathing. Now the tool has updated and is showing exposure patterns for 5 exposures at the same time. When we do this, the visualization gets more crowded and perhaps a bit more difficult to read. However, the overall picture still gives us a pretty good impression that these exposures are highly prevalent and commonly occur in the same occupations. If we were interested in looking closer at any one job, we could still click the job title again. For example, I can click into job clerks and see the respective numbers exposed to the different exposures. And I can return to the original view by clicking the job title again. Let's change the view back to something less busy. Diesel engine exposure, as shown here, is associated with lung cancer. Similar to the exposure field, we can add countries to the country field as well. For instance, if I were interested in diesel exposure in the Benelux countries, I could simply add Belgium and Luxembourg to the country field. The visualization now shows the total number of exposed workers by occupation in the Benelux countries in 2018. Our tool does not show comparison between countries. It is our intention to not highlight differences between countries because national exposure prevalence estimates represent differences in population, employment patterns, and perhaps EuroJEM exposure assessment. Before we go back to the slides, I would also like to show you the homepage tab, where we also have links and different useful information for our visitors. Okay, let's go back to the slides. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the tour of the OEV. Let's go over how we imagine the tool would be used and who would find the tool useful. We imagine occupational safety and health professionals, policymakers, and workers would all find OEV potentially useful to visualize exposure patterns by occupation, country, time period, and worker sex. We think seeing and exploring exposure patterns raise awareness of exposures at work. By providing different options, we also enable exposure prevention and intervention efforts that's more tailored to user needs. For instance, one user group may be interested in career options after a physical injury, so they may wish to see and avoid jobs that are likely to be exposed to high physical workload. Another example would be to specifically focus on occupational exposures for female workers, who may have different exposure patterns than men, but exposure information is often unavailable for women. Finally, if you find that you're interested in more specific information than shown by our tool, then perhaps a full version of the EuroJEM would be appropriate. There are a few assumptions and limitations of OEV I should mention. For privacy reasons, Eurostat only provides occupation information at a 3-digit ISCO level. Because the EuroJEM is best applied at the most detailed 4-digit ISCO level, we had to make some assumptions on the distribution of workers in the 4-digit groups. To give you a concrete example, Eurostat only provides the number of workers under ISCO code 833 heavy truck and bus drivers for different occupations. For the different countries. And we do not know exactly how many 8331 bus drivers and 8332 truck drivers are there for Italy, for instance. Because we have access to full workforce information in the Netherlands, we have applied the Dutch ratio of bus drivers versus truck drivers for all European countries. We realize this may result in some inaccuracies for some occupations, but this is an assumption we had to make in order for the tool to work. If anyone listening to the audio have access to national level employment information at a 4-digit ISCO level and can provide the data to us, we would love to be able to check and update this assumption. Secondly, because EuroJEM is developing using existing exposure data, and because data availability varies highly across different European countries, the accuracy of exposure estimates may be lower for countries where data is limited, particularly for Central and Eastern Europe. If anyone listening has access to exposure data and would share that with us, we would love to be able to update our EuroJEM estimates. Lastly, OEV can only provide population-level exposure patterns rather than personal exposure estimates. This is because personal exposure is highly variable, depending on factors such as workplace, individual characteristics, and habits, even if the workers share the same job title. This is only the beginning of OEV. The tool will be hosted and maintained by TNO beyond the end of the EPHOR project. We plan on adding more exposures to OEV. Currently, heat and airborne infections agents are planned. We'll also keep OEV updated when EuroJEM estimates are updated, as well as when Eurostat releases new data on employment patterns. The OEV is now available through the WeExpose website, which is the official toolbox repository for the EPHOR project. We encourage you to give the tool a try, and we appreciate your feedback. The OEV, EuroJEM, and the entire EPHOR project is the hard work of many different partners. I would like to thank everyone involved and highlight the special contributions of my Work Package 2 EuroJEM colleagues for the good collaboration on this tool. Thank you for your time.